The toast was to her cousin's health, but the wine in Constance Abbott's glass tasted of betrayal. It sat on her tongue, thin and acidic, a perfect mirror to the pronouncement her Aunt Philippa had just made to the assembled ladies of Marley. "And we are all so terribly grateful," her aunt cooed, her voice a confection of spun sugar and steel, "that dear Mr. Crane has offered our Constance a position at Alderbrook. Such a charitable act, to give the girl something useful to do." A murmur of polite agreement rippled through the drawing room. Constance kept her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the window, where the late autumn sky was the colour of a fading bruise. She did not look at the pitying faces of the women, nor at the triumphant glint in her aunt's eye. She simply held her glass, her fingers steady, her spine straight. The position was not a charity. It was a transaction. Constance was the currency, and her aunt was spending her to settle a continent of debt. For 10 years, since her parents' death had left her a ward of her only living relative, Constance had been the invisible engine of her aunt's household. She was the one who managed the accounts, stretching a dwindling inheritance to cover the cost of Philippa's gowns and card parties. She was the one who placated the butcher, negotiated with the wine merchant, and kept the books so meticulously that the bailiffs, who circled their respectable little house in town like patient vultures, were always kept 1 month, 1 week, 1 agonizing day at bay. She did this not for gratitude, which was never offered, but for the quiet roof over her head and for the memory of her father, a quiet scholar who had taught her the value of numbers, of order, of seeing things as they truly were. Her aunt saw her as a tool, a plain and unmarriageable niece who was, thankfully, clever with figures. The ladies of Marley saw her as a shadow, the quiet girl in the corner with her mending. No one saw the nights she spent poring over her father's old books on agriculture, on land management, on botany, worlds away from the stifling propriety of the drawing room. No one saw the fierce, contained intelligence that burned behind her calm grey eyes. No one, until Mr. Gideon Crane. He had come to their house precisely once, a week prior. A man forged from northern industry and old money, he had the stillness of a winter mountain. He was tall and severe, his face a collection of hard lines and shadows, his eyes the colour of a frozen lake. He had recently inherited the vast, derelict estate of Alderbrook, which bordered 3 villages and had, in his grandfather's time, fed them all. Now its fields lay fallow, its tenants were struggling, and the great house itself was a hollow shell. Mr. Crane, consumed by his shipping interests in the north, had no time for it. He needed a steward, an archivist, someone to go through the husk of the estate and determine if anything of value remained. His solicitor had recommended Constance, not by name, but by description. "Mrs. Abbott's niece," the man had said. "They say she can make a shilling do the work of a pound." So Gideon Crane had come. He had not wasted a moment on pleasantries. He had sat opposite Constance at the polished dining table, ignoring her aunt's fluttering attempts at social grace, and laid out the terms with blunt, chilling clarity. "I require a full accounting of the Alderbrook estate. Every book, every deed, every piece of furniture, every acre. I need to know its assets and its liabilities, down to the last farthing. I am told you are capable of such work." It was not a question. It was a challenge. Constance had met his gaze directly. "I am." He had nodded, a short, sharp gesture. "The salary will be £50 per annum, paid to your aunt for your keep. You will reside at Alderbrook. You will report to me, by letter, on the 1st of every month. I expect nothing but facts. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Mr. Crane," she had said, her voice even. And that was that. A contract made, a life sold. Philippa had been ecstatic, seeing only the £50 a year, a sum that would clear her most pressing debts, and the convenience of having her inconvenient niece removed from sight. To the world, she painted it as an act of kindness from a wealthy landowner to a poor relation. To Constance, in the privacy of her small bedroom that night, she had been more honest. "It is a godsend, Constance. The place is a ruin, of course, a lost cause, but it will keep you occupied and out from under my feet. Try not to make a mess of it." Now, in the drawing room, the lie of it all settled like dust. A lost cause. The words echoed in her mind as she finally lowered her glass, the bitter wine untouched. She looked out the window again, toward the west, where the unseen lands of Alderbrook lay sleeping. Everyone saw a ruin, a failure, a place of endings. But Constance, who had spent a decade creating substance from nothing, felt a strange and unfamiliar flicker. It was not hope. It was something harder, more practical. It was the thrill of a problem to be solved. She would go to Alderbrook. She would face the cold house and the empty fields. She would take their measure, down to the last farthing, down to the last stone. She would give Mr. Gideon Crane his facts, and in that broken, abandoned place, perhaps she could finally build something that was her own. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She simply finished her packing, her movements precise and economical, a quiet declaration of intent against the noise of her aunt's false pity. The carriage was waiting. The carriage wheels ground to a halt on a gravel drive that was more weed than stone. Constance peered through the window, her first glimpse of Alderbrook confirming her aunt's bleak assessment. The house was a hulking Jacobean shadow against the bruised twilight, its many windows like vacant eyes. Stone finials on the roof were chipped and broken, and a creeping ivy, thick as a man's arm, was slowly consuming the west wing, its tendrils prying at the mortar between the great blocks of granite. There was no light, no sign of welcome. The air itself seemed to hang heavy and still, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The coachman, a local man from Marley with a face like a worried potato, cleared his throat. "This be it, miss. Alderbrook." He sounded as if he were announcing a sentence. He helped her down, his hand rough but careful on her elbow, and deposited her single trunk on the moss-slicked stone steps. "Mrs. Kemp. Hannah, they call her. She's the housekeeper. She'll be expecting you." He seemed eager to leave, casting nervous glances at the darkening woods that pressed in on all sides of the house. With the tip of his hat, he was back on his box, and the carriage rattled away, its sound swallowed by the profound silence. Constance was alone. She stood on the steps for a long moment, the chill of the evening seeping through the thin wool of her cloak. She took a breath. The air was cold, but clean, sharper than the cloying, perfume-laden air of her aunt's drawing room. She raised her hand and knocked on the enormous oak door. The sound was flat, absorbed by the wood. She waited. 1 second. 2. She knocked again, harder this time, the rap of her knuckles sharp and clear. Finally, bolts groaned from within, a sound of deep protest. The door opened a crack, and a sliver of candlelight illuminated a stern, weathered face. A woman in her late 50s, hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her features taut, regarded her with undisguised suspicion. Her eyes were small and bright, like a bird's. "Miss Abbott." The voice was gravelly, unused. "Yes, and you are Mrs. Kemp?" "I am." The housekeeper, Hannah, did not open the door any wider. "You'd best come in. The damp gets in everything." She stepped back, and Constance entered a hall of staggering size and profound gloom. A single candle on a nearby table did little to pierce the darkness, revealing only glimpses of a soaring hammer-beam roof lost in shadow, walls lined with the pale ghosts of removed paintings, and a floor of flagstones that gleamed wetly in the faint light. The cold was a physical presence. It was not the crisp cold of a winter's day, but a deep, penetrating cold that came from the very stones of the house, a cold of neglect. "Mr. Crane's letter said you'd be taking inventory," Hannah said, her tone making the word sound like an accusation. "The master's study is this way. That's where the books are. What's left of them." She led Constance down a long, echoing corridor. Their footsteps were the only sound. Portraits in heavy gilt frames, so coated in dust they were almost featureless, watched them pass. Here and there, a sheet covered a piece of furniture, its shape lumpen and ghostly. Most of the rooms they passed were simply empty, their doors slightly ajar, revealing bare floors and dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight from the tall windows. This was not a house that was sleeping. It was a house that had died. The study was at the end of the wing. It was smaller than the other rooms, but no less neglected. Bookshelves lined the walls, but many were empty. Those that held books were in disarray, volumes lying on their sides, spines broken. A thick layer of dust covered every surface. In the center of the room was a large desk, its leather top cracked and peeling. "Your room is upstairs. I'll show you after," Hannah said, placing the candle on the desk. "There's a fire laid in there, but it'll take time to chase the chill. Supper is bread and cheese. The larder is near bare, has been for a year or more." She said it matter-of-factly, a statement of grim reality, not a complaint. Constance ran a gloved finger along the edge of the desk. It came away black. "Thank you, Mrs. Kemp. This will do for now." The housekeeper hesitated, seeming to expect a protest, a lamentation. When Constance offered none, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, crossed her face. "The old master, Mr. Crane's grandfather, he kept everything in here. Every bill, every map. After he passed, the last master, he wasn't one for details." The contempt in her voice was quiet but absolute. "Most of it was sold off. The silver, the good furniture. To pay debts." Constance nodded, her mind already working, cataloguing. So the stripping of the house had begun before Gideon Crane's inheritance. This was a crucial fact. "And the estate ledgers, from the grandfather's time?" Hannah gestured to a tall, locked cabinet in the corner. "In there, I'd wager, if they weren't burned. The key's been lost for 20 years. Constance looked at the cabinet, then back at the desk. Her work would begin here. She was not afraid of dust, or cold, or the silence of a forgotten house. They were honest things. She preferred them to the smiling lies of her aunt's world. "Mrs. Kemp," she said, her voice clear and calm in the dead air. "Could you bring me another candle, and perhaps a cloth?" Hannah stared at her for a beat. "You're starting now?" "There's no sense in waiting for the sun," Constance replied. "It will only show us the same room, but in better light." A small, dry sound, almost a laugh, escaped the housekeeper. She gave a curt nod and left, her footsteps receding down the corridor. Constance was alone again. But this time, the solitude felt different. It was not abandonment. It was purpose. She took off her cloak, laying it carefully over a shrouded chair. She pulled a small leather-bound notebook and a pencil from her reticule. At the top of the first clean page, she wrote the date, and beneath it, 2 words: Alderbrook Estate. The work had begun. The first week at Alderbrook was a descent into a world of dust and decay. Constance rose each morning before the sun, her breath pluming in the frigid air of her bedroom, and worked until her candle burned down to a stub late at night. She was methodical, relentless. She started with the house itself, moving from room to empty room with her notebook and a measuring tape, creating a floor plan, noting the state of the plaster, the condition of the windows, the presence of rot in the floorboards. She found evidence of a life hastily packed and sold: empty jewel cases in a lady's dressing room, a child's rocking horse with a missing runner, a library with its shelves stripped bare, save for a few forgotten volumes of dreary sermons. Hannah watched her with a wary, silent appraisal. The housekeeper, who had served the Crane family for 40 years, was the last remaining servant, a solitary guardian of the estate's decline. She had expected a flighty, complaining girl from town. Instead, she saw a woman who worked with the quiet intensity of a master craftsman. Constance asked for nothing but hot water in the morning and a fresh candle at night. She ate the simple meals of bread, cheese, and a thin vegetable soup without comment, her focus entirely on the task at hand. On the third day, Hannah found her not in the house, but outside, pacing the perimeter of the vast, dead kitchen garden. The box hedges were overgrown and wild, the glass in the cold frames was shattered, and the earth was choked with weeds. But in one sheltered corner, a single, stubborn rosebush, which had somehow survived the neglect, clung to life. It was a gnarled, thorny thing, but it bore one perfect, deep crimson bloom, a defiant splash of colour against the grey stone wall. Constance was gently clearing the weeds from its base with her bare hands. "That's the old master's rose," Hannah said, her voice startling Constance. "The crimson rambler. He was proud of that one." Constance looked up, her fingers smudged with dirt. "It's beautiful. It deserves a chance." Hannah said nothing, but that evening, a pair of sturdy gardening gloves and a rusty trowel appeared outside Constance's bedroom door. It was the first gesture of alliance, a silent admission of respect. The true prize, however, remained the locked cabinet in the study. It was a heavy piece of oak, bound with iron, and the lock was intricate. On the morning of her 8th day at Alderbrook, Constance was examining it for the 10th time when she noticed a small, almost invisible seam in the carved panelling at its base. Her fingers traced it, pressing gently. A section of the moulding clicked and swung outward, revealing not a key, but a small, flat iron lever. With a grunt of effort, she pulled it. There was a loud clank from within the cabinet, and when she tried the handle, the door swung open. A wave of musty air, the scent of dry paper and forgotten time, washed over her. The cabinet was filled, top to bottom, with enormous, leather-bound ledgers. Each was marked with a year, starting in the late 18th century and ending precisely 21 years ago, the year Gideon Crane's grandfather had died. Constance pulled one out. It was heavy, the paper thick and fibrous. She opened it on the desk, which she had scrubbed clean, and her breath caught. It was not just numbers. The old master had recorded everything: crop yields, rainfall, soil temperatures, planting schedules, notes on which fields were to lie fallow and for how long. There were hand-drawn maps detailing drainage ditches, water sources, and boundary lines. It was a complete history of the land, a scientific document of breathtaking detail. Here, in this dusty cabinet, was the secret to Alderbrook's former prosperity. She spent the rest of the day, and the next, lost in their pages, her mind absorbing the patterns, the rhythms of the land, the lost knowledge. She understood now. Alderbrook was not dead. It had been put to sleep by ignorance. It was on the following afternoon, as she was cross-referencing a map of water rights from 1820 with a more recent county survey, that she heard the sound of a horse outside. It was not the slow clop of a farm cart, but the crisp, powerful stride of a thoroughbred. A moment later, the front door opened and closed with a decisive bang that echoed through the silent house. Heavy, confident footsteps approached the study. The door swung open without a knock. Gideon Crane stood on the threshold, filling the frame. He was dressed for riding, in mud-splattered boots and a heavy wool coat that did nothing to soften the severity of his frame. His dark hair was damp with mist, and his eyes, as cold and clear as she remembered, swept the room, taking in the clean desk, the open ledger, the stacks of paper covered in her neat, precise script. "I was not expecting you until the 1st of the month, Mr. Crane," Constance said, rising to her feet. Her heart was beating a little faster, but her voice was steady. "I was in the county on other business," he said, his tone clipped. He walked into the room, his presence seeming to shrink its dimensions. He stopped at the desk, looking down at the open ledger. His gaze fell on the hand-drawn map she had been studying. "Where did you find this?" "In the locked cabinet. The key was misplaced. I found another way in." His eyes flicked to her face, a brief, sharp assessment. There was no praise, but she saw a flicker of something that was not displeasure. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. "Show me what you have learned." For the next hour, Constance spoke. She did not offer opinions or feelings. She gave him facts. She reported on the state of the house, the value of its remaining contents, negligible, and the cost of necessary repairs, extensive. She detailed the acreage of the estate, the number of tenant farms, and their current dismal state. Then, she turned to the ledgers. She explained his grandfather's system of crop rotation, the careful management of the water meadows, the specific fertilizers, lime, marl, he had used to enrich the soil. She spoke of a place that had been a marvel of agricultural science, a balanced and productive ecosystem. Gideon listened in absolute silence, his expression unreadable. He did not sit. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, watching her. He was utterly still, but she could feel the force of his attention, a palpable pressure in the quiet room. When she was finished, the silence stretched. She thought of her aunt, of the Marley ladies, of all the people who had never truly listened to a word she said. She had just delivered the most complex and important report of her life to a man made of iron and shadow, and she had no idea if he had heard her at all. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet. "The West Fields, the ones bordering the Devereux property. My grandfather's notes. What do they say of them?" Constance turned a few pages in the ledger. "They were his most productive. For wheat. He notes a series of spring-fed irrigation channels that kept them watered, even in dry seasons." "Those channels are gone," Gideon said, his voice flat. "The fields are dust." "Yes," Constance agreed. "The county survey map shows the springs originating on a rise of land that now belongs to Mr. Lucien Devereux. The channels appear to have been diverted." He looked at her then, a long, direct look. "You have been here 10 days, Miss Abbott. You have done more than the last agent did in a year." He walked back to the desk and picked up a small, folded piece of paper he had placed there upon entering. He pushed it toward her. "This is a draft on my bank in Marley for £200, for estate expenses. You will open an account in your name. You will have full authority to purchase what is needed: seed, tools, wages for laborers should you require them. Keep a strict account. Constance stared at the paper. It was an impossible sum, an unthinkable amount of trust. Mr. Crane, I did not hire you to manage a museum of dust, he said, his voice cutting through her surprise. I hired you to give me facts. The fact is, the estate is failing. Your findings suggest a way it might not. That is a fact I wish to pursue. He turned to leave, then paused at the door, his back to her. Hannah tells me you have been tending my grandfather's rose. Constance was taken aback by the sudden shift. It seemed a shame to let it die. He was silent for a moment. Yes, he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. It would be. And then he was gone, his footsteps once again echoing down the hall, before the front door closed with that same final thud. Constance stood alone in the study, the bank draft in her hand. The paper was crisp, real. £200. Authority. Trust. A seed had been planted, not in the dead fields of Alderbrook, but in the cold, silent rooms of its forgotten house. And for the first time in a very long time, Constance Abbott felt the fragile, unfamiliar warmth of the sun on her face. With Gideon Crane's trust came the weight of expectation, but it was a weight Constance found she was uniquely suited to bear. It was a relief to exchange the burden of managing her aunt's social pretenses for the solid, tangible problems of Alderbrook. The £200, a fortune to her, became a weapon against the decay. Her first act was to hire 2 men from the village of Marley, brothers named Jen and Wilf, whose family had worked for the Cranes for generations, but had been let go years before. They were strong, quiet, and knew the land. Under Constance's direction, guided by the wisdom in the old ledgers, they began the slow work of reclamation. She did not attempt to tackle the entire estate at once. That would be folly. Instead, she chose a 10-acre plot, a manageable section of the kitchen garden and the small meadow behind it. It was a microcosm of the whole, a place to test the old master's methods. The change at Alderbrook was at first subtle, then undeniable. The clatter of Jem and Wilf's shovels replaced the oppressive silence. The scent of burning weeds and newly turned earth began to overpower the smell of damp and dust. Constance, using a portion of the funds, had the larder stocked with flour, salt, bacon, and tea. The aroma of baking bread began to drift from Hannah's kitchen for the first time in years. The housekeeper herself seemed to stand a little straighter. The suspicious squint in her eyes was replaced by a look of grudging respect, which slowly softened into something akin to affection. She started leaving a hot cup of tea on the study desk for Constance in the afternoons, a small, unspoken ritual of camaraderie. Constance lived in the ledgers. She discovered that Gideon's grandfather had used a specific 7-year rotation of crops: wheat, then barley, then turnips, then a year of clover to replenish the nitrogen in the soil, followed by another cycle. It was brilliant, sustainable, and completely forgotten. She also found his detailed notes on the kitchen garden, which had once supplied not only the great house, but also a surplus that was sold at market in Marley. Armed with this knowledge, she and her small team went to work. They repaired the shattered cold frames, reglazed them with new glass. They cleared the choked beds, dug in manure from a neighboring farm, and planted winter vegetables according to the old master's schedule: kale, leeks, cabbages that would stand through the frost. They pruned the gnarled apple trees in the derelict orchard, and Constance herself continued to tend the single, stubborn rosebush, which, freed from the choking weeds, began to produce new, healthy green shoots. The house itself was changing. With fires lit daily in the study and the kitchen, a core of warmth began to push back against the deep, stony chill. The damp receded. Hannah began the colossal task of cleaning, her movements brisk with a renewed sense of purpose. One crisp November afternoon, as Constance was directing Wilf in the repair of a low stone wall, a rider approached. It was not Gideon Crane. This man sat his horse with a practiced, languid grace, and he was smiling. He was handsome, in a polished, aristocratic way, with fair hair and eyes the blue of a summer sky. He dismounted, handing the reins to a groom who seemed to appear from nowhere. "Miss Abbott, I presume?" he said, his voice smooth as cream. He swept off his hat in a theatrical bow. "Lucian Devereux, at your service. My estate, Pellingham, is your nearest neighbour. I must confess, the activity at Alderbrook has become the talk of the county." Constance straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. She recognized the name instantly. It was his land where the springs that once fed Alderbrook's best fields now originated. "Mr. Devereux?" "I came to offer my condolences," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "It is a Herculean task you've been set. My father always said Alderbrook was a lost cause. The soil is soured, I'm afraid." "The soil is tired, Mr. Devereux, not soured," Constance corrected him quietly. "It needs to be fed and rested, like any living thing." His smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "A charmingly rustic philosophy. But I fear you will find agriculture in this county is a matter of brute reality, not poetry. Crane is a fool to throw money at this dust bowl. He is a man of the city, of machines. He does not understand the land." He gestured vaguely toward the west. "Those fields over there, for instance, utterly useless. I offered to buy them from him, to fold them into my own estate for a fair price, simply to put them out of their misery. He was unresponsive." Constance thought of the ledgers, of the notes on the spring-fed irrigation channels. She thought of the diverted water. "Mr. Crane has not yet decided what he will do with the land," she said, her tone non-committal. "Well, when he comes to his senses and decides to cut his losses, you will let me know," Lucian said, his charm switched back on like a lantern. He glanced around at the work, the neat rows of new plantings, the repaired wall. "You have certainly made a valiant effort. A woman of many talents." The compliment felt like an insult, a condescending pat on the head. He bowed again, mounted his horse, and cantered away, leaving behind a faint, cloying scent of cologne, and the distinct feeling of being watched. The encounter left Constance unsettled. Lucian Devereux's concern was a performance, his charm a veneer over something hard and acquisitive. He wanted Alderbrook's land, and he saw her as a temporary, perhaps amusing, obstacle. A week later, a letter arrived from Gideon. It was brief, as always. "Miss Abbott, your monthly report was received. The expenditures are acceptable. The progress is noted. I have been made aware of Mr. Devereux's interest in the western fields. Do not entertain any offers from him. Do not grant him access to the property. Continue your work on the 10-acre plot. I will be at Alderbrook before Christmas. G. Crane." The final line was unexpected. He was coming back, not for a brief transactional visit, but for a longer stay. Constance folded the letter, her mind racing. Christmas was only a few weeks away. The thought of his presence in the house, not as a fleeting visitor, but as its master, was both daunting and, to her own surprise, strangely welcome. Alderbrook was coming back to life, and its owner was coming home. The stakes of her experiment had just been raised considerably. The quiet transformation was about to have an audience. The first snow of the season fell 2 weeks before Christmas, a soft, thick blanket that covered the sins of the land, turning the grey, fallow fields of Alderbrook into a vast expanse of pristine white. Inside the great house, however, a quiet war against the cold was being won. The main fires in the great hall and the drawing room were now lit daily, their flames devouring logs that Jem and Wilf had cut and stacked. The heat baked the damp out of the tapestries Hannah had painstakingly cleaned, and the air, for the first time, felt breathable, almost warm. Constance's 10-acre experiment was yielding its first results. The kale and leeks in the kitchen garden were thriving, their dark green leaves a startling, vital contrast to the snow. The small harvest was more than enough for the household, and Constance had begun sending a weekly cart with the surplus to the parish almshouse in Marley, a gesture that did not go unnoticed. The trickle of life returning to Alderbrook was becoming a current. Gideon Crane arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced as before. This time, he was not alone. He came in a heavy, solid travelling coach, and with him was his valet, a man as silent and severe as his master, and a mountain of luggage. He was not here for a visit. He was moving in. He found Constance in the study, where she was drafting a plan for the spring planting. The room was transformed. A large fire crackled in the hearth. The desk was organised, the ledgers neatly stacked, and on a side table, a vase held a single, perfect crimson rose, plucked that morning from the hardy bush outside. Gideon stopped in the doorway, his gaze taking in the scene. The deep chill of the house had been replaced by a livable warmth. The oppressive silence was broken by the crackle of the fire and the distant, rhythmic thump of an axe splitting wood. He looked at Constance, who had risen to her feet, and for the first time, his expression was not entirely guarded. A hint of something, surprise, satisfaction, softened the hard line of his mouth. "Miss Abbott," he said. The words were the same, but the tone was different. There was a new resonance to it, a warmth that seemed to borrow from the fire. "Mr. Crane, welcome home." The words slipped out before she could stop them. It was a presumption, but it felt true. Over the next few days, the house adjusted to his presence. He was a quiet master, rising early and spending most of his days in the study with Constance, poring over the ledgers and her reports. He was a man who craved information, who built his world on a foundation of solid facts. He listened intently as she explained her plans for the spring, her logic rooted in his grandfather's writings. She proposed a significant expansion of their efforts, to reclaim another 50 acres, to purchase 2 draft horses and a new plough. "It will require a further £500, she stated, laying the budget out on the desk. It was a simple sheet of paper, every potential cost accounted for. He studied it for a long time, his finger tracing the column of figures. "The risk is substantial." "The cost of doing nothing is greater," she countered gently. "The land will only fall further into ruin. The tenant farms will fail completely. This is not a risk. It is an investment in a proven method." He looked up from the paper, his gaze meeting hers. "Proven a generation ago. The climate may have changed. The soil may be different." "Some things do not change, Mr. Crane," she said. "Good husbandry, careful planning, hard work." He was silent for a moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. "You will have the funds." Their days fell into a rhythm. They worked together in the study, a strange partnership of northern industrialist and quiet scholar. He was blunt, demanding, and precise. She was calm, knowledgeable, and unshakable. He would fire off a series of rapid questions about soil composition or seed prices, and she would answer each one without hesitation, citing a page number from a ledger or a figure from her own accounts. A grudging respect grew between them, built on a shared language of facts and figures. But there were other moments too, small, unguarded instances that revealed the man beneath the iron exterior. One evening, he found her in the neglected library, running her hand over the empty shelves. "They were sold," he said, his voice quiet behind her. "My father sold them. First editions, illuminated manuscripts. He sold them for a fraction of their worth to pay his gambling debts." There was no anger in his voice, only a flat, weary emptiness. "He sold everything that was not nailed down. My mother's jewelry, my grandfather's prize herds." He paused. "He tried to sell the house itself." Constance turned to him. In the dim, firelit room, the shadows were deep on his face. She saw not a cold industrialist, but a man burdened by the failures of his predecessor, a son left to clean up the wreckage of his father's life. "He did not succeed," she said softly. "No," Gideon said, his eyes on the empty shelves. "My wife, my late wife, Delia, her dowry stopped the sale. It was the last thing she did." He spoke the words as if they were stones in his mouth. He had not spoken of his wife before. The entire county knew he was a widower, but the story was a closed book. It was not pity she felt for him. It was a shock of recognition. He too was cleaning up a mess he had not made. He too was living in the shadow of another's carelessness. The space between them, once a formal gulf of employer and employee, suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. The opposition, however, was not idle. Lucien Devereux began to make his presence felt. He hosted a lavish Christmas party at Pellingham, inviting all the local gentry. An invitation was sent to Alderbrook, addressed pointedly to Gideon Crane, Esquire. Constance's name was absent, a deliberate social cut. Gideon left the invitation unanswered on the mantelpiece. Then the sabotage began. It was subtle, deniable. A section of the newly repaired stone wall collapsed overnight, too neatly to be an accident. One of the cold frames was found with its glass systematically shattered again. Jem and Wilf were furious, but there was no proof of who was responsible. Constance documented each incident in her ledger, her script as neat and dispassionate as ever, but a cold knot of anger tightened in her stomach. Lucien Devereux was not just a charming rival. He was a vandal. He could not stand to see Alderbrook reviving. Its success was a threat to him, though she did not yet fully understand why. She was beginning to suspect it was about more than just a few acres of dusty fields. It was about the water. It was about the secrets buried in the old master's maps. Gideon stood at the window of the study, looking out at the snow-covered landscape of his inheritance. For years he had thought of Alderbrook only as a name on a deed, a financial drain, a monument to his father's fecklessness. He had kept his distance, burying his grief and his resentment in the relentless logic of industry, in the building of his shipping empire in the soot-stained north. The north was honest. A machine either worked or it did not. A contract was either honored or it was broken. There were no ghosts there. Here, the ghosts were everywhere. The ghost of his brilliant grandfather, the ghost of his ruinous father, and the ghost of his wife, Delia, a gentle, fragile woman who had hated the country and had withered in the cold shadow of this house. Her money had saved it, but the saving had cost him her. He had not been back for more than a day at a time since she had died in this very house, in a room overlooking the dead gardens. He had come back now with the intention of liquidating the asset. He would sell the land tear down the house, and erase this painful chapter of his family's history. He had hired Miss Abbott to provide him with the cold, hard data to execute this plan. But she had given him something else entirely. He turned from the window and looked at her, seated at the desk. She was bent over one of his grandfather's ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight caught the warm brown of her hair and the curve of her cheek. She was not beautiful in the way Delia had been beautiful. There was nothing fragile about her. She was like a well-made tool, practical, strong, perfectly suited to her purpose. And yet, he had watched her for weeks. He had seen the way she moved, with a quiet economy of motion that wasted nothing. He had heard her speak to the workmen, her voice calm and authoritative, earning their respect not through command, but through competence. He had seen her hands, stained with dirt from the garden, carefully tending the rosebush his grandfather had planted. A rosebush Delia had wanted ripped out, calling it an old-fashioned weed. Constance Abbott had looked at this ruin, and she had not seen a lost cause. She had seen a system, a problem to be solved. She had breathed life back into the cold heart of this house. He found himself looking forward to their sessions in the study, to the crisp clarity of her mind, to the way she would look up at him, her grey eyes serious and direct, and present a fact that would elegantly dismantle a problem he had thought insurmountable. He knew about Lucien Devereux. He had known the Devereux family his whole life. They were old gentry, with a lineage stretching back centuries and a carefully polished veneer of civility that concealed a grasping, desperate greed. He knew Lucien wanted the western fields. Gideon's father, in a drunken card game, had lost the parcel of land where the springs originated. It had been a catastrophic loss, the beginning of the end for Alderbrook. Lucien's father had immediately diverted the water, choking the life from the Crane estate's best land. It was legal, but it was an act of brutal opportunism. Now, Lucien was circling again. The small acts of sabotage were his way of testing the defenses, of reminding Gideon that Alderbrook was vulnerable. He wanted Gideon to believe the land was worthless, to sell it to him for a pittance. But Gideon was looking at Constance, who had just made a small notation in her accounts ledger, her expression one of deep satisfaction. She was his defense. And he was beginning to realize, with a sense of dislocation that was both unnerving and deeply compelling, that he no longer wanted to sell. He no longer wanted to erase this place. He wanted to see what she could build here. He wanted to see the fields green again. He wanted to stand with her and watch the harvest come in. It was an illogical, inefficient, and entirely new desire. And it was aimed not just at the land, but at the quiet, capable woman who understood its secrets. He had come here to close a book, but Constance Abbott was writing a new chapter, and he found he was desperate to know how it ended. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The new year arrived not with celebration, but with a hard, biting frost that glazed the trees in ice and made the ground as unyielding as iron. The work outside slowed to a crawl. But inside Alderbrook, Constance's plans for the spring took shape. With the £500 from Gideon, she had purchased 2 enormous Suffolk Punch horses, a breed his grandfather had favoured for their strength and gentle temperament. They stood in the repaired stables, their breath steaming in the cold air, solid, living promises of the work to come. She had also ordered a new plough, and sacks of seed corn and barley were stacked in a dry barn, waiting for the thaw. Gideon remained at the estate, a silent, watchful presence. The initial formality between him and Constance had settled into a comfortable, productive quiet. They spent their evenings in the study, often working late into the night, a silent partnership forged over maps and account books. He rarely spoke of personal matters, but she learned to read the nuances in his silence, the slight softening of his expression when she presented a particularly elegant solution to a problem, the hard set of his jaw when the topic of the Devereux land arose. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Constance made the discovery that would change everything. She was studying one of the oldest maps, dated 1798, which detailed the estate's original boundaries. Tucked into a sleeve at the back of the heavy leather-bound atlas, her fingers found the edge of another document. It was not a map, but a folded piece of vellum, brittle with age. She carefully unfolded it under the lamplight. It was a formal agreement, a deed of covenant, signed by Gideon's great-grandfather and Lucien Devereux's great-grandfather. It was a water rights agreement. In it, the Crane family had granted the Devereux family the rights to draw water from the springs for their own household and livestock. But the agreement contained a crucial, legally binding clause. In exchange for this right, the Devereux family was obligated to maintain the irrigation channels that fed the western fields of Alderbrook. The agreement stated explicitly that the flow to Alderbrook could never be obstructed, diverted, or diminished. The covenant was tied to the land itself, not to the owners. It was perpetual. Constance's heart began to beat a steady, heavy rhythm. She read it again, then a third time. The Devereux family had not just taken advantage of a neighbor's misfortune. They had actively breached a generations-old legal covenant. For 20 years, they had been illegally starving Alderbrook's land of its lifeblood. The sale of the springlands by Gideon's father did not nullify the covenant. It was an easement that ran with the title. Lucien Devereux was not just an opportunist, he was a thief. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with intensity. He looked up from the shipping manifest he was reading. "What is it?" She pushed the vellum document across the desk toward him. "I believe you will want to see this." He took it, his long fingers surprisingly gentle with the fragile document. He read it, his face a mask of concentration. When he looked up, his eyes were like chips of ice. The coldness was back, but it was not the cold of emotional distance. It was the cold of fury, controlled and absolute. "My grandfather knew of this," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. "He mentioned it once. He said the Devereux were bound to us by water. My father would have forgotten. Or worse, he would have known and not cared." He placed the document back on the desk with surgical precision. "This changes the matter entirely. This is not a negotiation. It is a restitution." "What will you do?" Constance asked. "I will see my solicitor in the morning. We will present this to Devereux. He will restore the water flow, or I will take him to court and ruin him." The words were delivered with a flat, final certainty that sent a shiver down her spine. But Lucien, it seemed, had his own sources of information. Perhaps a disgruntled former servant, or simply the gossip that flowed from the village. He must have sensed that his position was becoming precarious. He decided to strike first. The crisis came 2 days later. Gideon had ridden to Marley to meet with his solicitor, leaving Constance in charge at Alderbrook. She was in the stables, discussing the care of the new horses with Jem, when she saw a carriage approaching. It was not Gideon's coach. It was a light, fashionable gig, and driving it was Lucien Devereux. With him was his sister Louisa, a pretty but vapid girl known for her love of gossip, and another gentleman, a portly, red-faced man whom Constance recognized as Mr. Fletcher, the chairman of the County Agricultural Board. Constance felt a surge of alarm. This was a formal, public visit. A maneuver. "Miss Abbott," Lucian called out, his voice booming with false cheerfulness. "We were just passing and thought we would see your miraculous progress for ourselves. Mr. Fletcher has heard so much about it." Constance's mind raced. To refuse them entry would seem churlish and suspicious. She had no choice but to be gracious. "Of course, Mr. Devereux. Welcome to Alderbrook." She led them on a tour of the 10-acre plot. She showed them the healthy winter greens, the repaired cold frames, the neat stacks of firewood. She spoke calmly, giving them the facts of the yields, the cost of the seed, the man-hours worked. Mr. Fletcher seemed grudgingly impressed, nodding and making thoughtful sounds. Louisa looked bored. Lucian, however, was barely paying attention. His eyes were scanning everything, a subtle, acquisitive gleam in their depths. Their tour ended in the study. Hannah had brought in tea, and Constance found herself playing the reluctant hostess. "It is a remarkable achievement, Miss Abbott, truly," Lucian said, setting his teacup down. "To have done so much with so little. Mr. Crane must be very trusting." He let the word hang in the air. "He has given you complete control of his finances for the estate, I hear." "I operate within an approved budget, Mr. Devereux," Constance said coolly. Of course," he smiled. "It's just that, well, rumours do fly. A great deal of money is being spent, and while these cabbages are very fine, one has to wonder if the accounts are quite in order." Constance stiffened. "My accounts are meticulous. They are available for Mr. Crane's inspection at any time." "I'm sure they are," Lucian said smoothly. He reached into his coat pocket. "It is merely a coincidence, I'm sure, but a rather concerning document came into my possession recently." He pulled out a folded piece of paper and laid it on the desk. "It appears to be a bill of sale from a jeweller in York for a diamond necklace, a rather expensive one." He pushed it toward her. "It is made out to you, Miss Abbott, and it is dated last month." Constance stared at the paper. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that, but it looked plausible enough on the surface. The cost was astronomical, £300, more than the entire budget she had been given for the initial restoration. The implication was clear and poisonous. She was embezzling funds from the estate to buy herself luxuries. "This is a fabrication," she said, her voice shaking slightly, despite her best efforts to control it. "Is it?" Lucian raised an eyebrow, looking at Mr. Fletcher, who was now staring at Constance with open suspicion. A young woman, alone, with access to a wealthy man's coffers. It is an old and sad story. Louisa Devereux gasped, her eyes wide. "Lucian, you can't possibly think—" "I think nothing, my dear sister," he said, cutting her off. "I merely present a curious document. It is for Mr. Crane to draw his own conclusions when he returns." He stood up, his work done. The poison had been administered. He had planted the seed of doubt, not just in her mind, but in that of the head of the Agricultural Board. He had laid his trap perfectly. When Gideon returned, he would not be met with the triumphant discovery of the water covenant, but with a sordid accusation of theft against the woman he had trusted. The battle for Alderbrook had just become a battle for her name, her honour, and her future. And as Lucian Devereux smiled his charming, predatory smile, Constance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The sound of Gideon's horse in the courtyard should have been a relief. Instead, it was a drumbeat of impending doom. Constance stood in the study, the forged bill of sale lying on the desk like a venomous snake. She had not moved it. She had not hidden it. To do so would be an admission of guilt. Her only defense was the truth, and the truth had to be faced head-on. He entered the room, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He was pulling off his gloves, his face set with the grim satisfaction of a man whose legal position has just been confirmed. My solicitor agrees. The covenant is ironclad. We will send a letter to Devereux tomorrow, demanding— He stopped. He saw her face, the pale, rigid set of her features. Then his eyes fell to the desk, to the paper lying there. He walked over and picked it up. He read it in silence. The room was so quiet, Constance could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. She watched his face for any sign, any flicker of emotion, but it was a mask of stone. He read it once, then again. The silence stretched, becoming a vast, empty space between them. This was the moment. The test. Everything she had built here, the trust she had so carefully earned, it all rested on this single, terrible point in time. "He was here," Constance said, her voice a low, taut thread. "Lucian Devereux. He brought Mr. Fletcher from the Agricultural Board. He showed them this." Gideon placed the paper back on the desk. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire, his profile a hard silhouette against the flames. The silence continued. 1 second. 2. 3. It was a lifetime. In that silence, she felt the foundation of her world crack. He had been betrayed by his father. He had been hurt by this house. His default was suspicion. His world was built on evidence, and here was a piece of evidence, damning and ugly. She thought of begging, of protesting her innocence, of crying. The hot sting of tears pricked at the back of her eyes, a humiliating, unfamiliar sensation. But she crushed it down. She had not begged her aunt for kindness. She would not beg this man for his trust. She would meet this accusation as she met every other problem, with facts. "Look at my books, Mr. Crane," she said, her voice gaining strength, shedding its tremor. "Look at the accounts. Every penny of the money you gave me is accounted for. The receipts are all there. The wages paid to Jem and Wilf. The bill for the seed from the merchant in Marley. The invoice for the horses. It is all there. You can send for the bank statements. You will find no £300 expenditure. You will find no jeweller from York." She took a breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop them from shaking. "Look at the work. Look at the gardens, the stables, the plans for the spring. Does that look like the work of a thief? Or does it look like the work of someone who is building what you asked her to build?" Still, he was silent. He turned from the fire, but his eyes were not on her. They were scanning the room. The neat stacks of ledgers, the vase with the single rose, the maps pinned to the wall. He was seeing the evidence of her labor, weighing it against the forged lie on his desk. Finally, he spoke. His voice was rough, as if it had been scraped raw. "Who did that to you?" The question was so unexpected, it took her a moment to understand. He was not asking about the forgery. His eyes were fixed on her left hand, which was resting on the desk. The back of it was raw and red, a nasty scrape she had gotten earlier that day when a loose stone on the crumbling stable wall had given way as she passed. She had barely noticed it. "It's nothing," she said, confused. "A stone from the wall." He stepped toward her and, without a word, took her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He turned it over, examining the scrape with a focused intensity. "This needs to be cleaned and dressed," he said. It was a plain, factual statement. He did not release her hand. He stood there, holding it, his thumb resting on her pulse point. And in that simple, grounding touch, The terrible tension in the room broke. It was not an absolution. It was something better. It was a choice. He had weighed the evidence, the physical proof of her hard work against the paper lie of a known enemy, and he had made his decision. He had chosen to believe in the scrape on her hand. "Devereux has overplayed his hand," Gideon said, his voice returning to its normal, decisive tone. He released her and walked back to the desk. He picked up the forgery, not with disgust, but with a kind of cold curiosity, as one might examine a faulty piece of machinery. "This is clumsy. The watermark on the paper is wrong for a York stationer. The ink is of a kind my solicitor identified as being favoured by a certain forger in London." He looked at her, and now his eyes were clear, the doubt entirely gone. "He thinks I am a fool." "He thinks I am my father." He tore the paper in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into the fire. They curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. "He is wrong," Gideon stated, "and he will learn just how wrong he is." The crisis was over. It had not been resolved with shouting or tears or dramatic protestations, but with quiet, plain speech and a scraped hand. The trust between them had not just been repaired, it had been tempered, forged in the fire of a direct attack, and emerging stronger, harder, and more real than before. Constance felt a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. She had been seen. She had been believed. "The County Agricultural Board meets in Marley in 1 week, Gideon said, his mind already moving to the next step, the counter-move. "Mr. Fletcher will be there. Lucien Devereux will be there. And we," he said, looking directly at Constance, "will be there too. You will bring your ledgers, Miss Abbott. All of them. It is time for a public accounting." The assembly room in Marley's town hall was packed. It was the annual winter meeting of the County Agricultural Board, an event usually attended only by landowners and tenant farmers. But today, the public gallery was full. Rumour, carried on the wind like seed, had spread through the county. There was to be a confrontation. Mr. Devereux of Pellingham had raised concerns about the management of Alderbrook. Mr. Crane, the mysterious industrialist, would be there to answer. It was the most exciting drama the county had seen in years. Constance sat at a long table at the front of the room, beside Gideon. In front of her, stacked in a neat, formidable pile, were her ledgers. The account books, the estate journals, the meticulously recorded plans for the spring. Her hands rested on the topmost volume. They were steady. She felt a strange, cold calm. All her life she had been invisible. Today, everyone would see her. Lady Ingram, a formidable dowager in her 70s, with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, presided over the meeting from a raised chair. As a magistrate's widow and the county's largest independent landowner, her opinion carried immense weight. She called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. After a few tedious items of business, she turned her piercing gaze on Lucien Devereux. "Mr. Devereux, the board understands you have a matter to bring to our attention regarding the Alderbrook estate." Lucien rose, the picture of concerned civility. He bowed to Lady Ingram, then to the assembly. "Indeed, my lady, it is with a heavy heart that I do so. We have all been gladdened to see some small signs of life returning to Alderbrook. However, I have become aware of certain irregularities that suggest the estate is being grossly mismanaged by Mr. Crane's appointed agent, Miss Abbott." A murmur went through the crowd. Constance saw her Aunt Philippa in the gallery, her face a mask of horrified fascination. Lucien continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Vast sums are being spent with very little to show for it, but a few cabbages and a great deal of broken stone. I have reason to believe that funds are being misappropriated. He did not produce the forgery. He was too clever for that. He simply planted the idea. Furthermore, he said, his tone shifting to one of public-spirited concern, the majority of the estate, particularly the crucial western fields, remains fallow and unproductive. This is a blight on our county and a hardship for the tenants. Therefore, I propose that the board intervene. I am prepared, as a gesture of goodwill to the community, to take over the management of those western fields myself. I will bring them back to productivity, for the good of all. He sat down to another murmur, this one of approbation. His proposal was clever. It painted him as a savior, and Constance as a thief, all without making a direct, legally actionable accusation. Lady Ingram looked from Lucian to Gideon. Mr. Crane, your response? Gideon did not rise. He simply inclined his head. Miss Abbott will respond. The accounts are her domain. All eyes turned to Constance. For a moment, she felt the immense pressure of their collective gaze. Then she looked at the ledgers in front of her facts, her truth. She rose to her feet. Mr. Devereux is correct on one point, she began, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. Vast sums are being spent at Alderbrook. I have the accounts for every penny here. She opened the first ledger. £112 for the repair of the stables and barns, £40 for seed, £200 for a pair of Suffolk Punch draft horses, £53 for a new plough and harness. Receipts for all are here for the board's inspection. She spoke for 10 minutes, her voice never wavering, as she laid out the entire financial story of Alderbrook's rebirth. It was a litany of practical, sensible investment. The narrative of theft evaporated in the face of her overwhelming documentation. Mr. Fletcher, the man Lucian had brought to the estate, was looking increasingly uncomfortable. As for the assertion that there is little to show for this expense, Constance continued, the first harvest from the kitchen garden, though small, has been enough to supply the house and to provide a weekly surplus to the Marley Almshouse for the past 6 weeks. A woman from the Almshouse Committee, seated in the gallery, called out, It's true! We've had fresh greens all winter, thanks to Alderbrook. Lady Ingram silenced her with a glare, but made a small, approving note on her paper. Then Constance turned to the heart of the matter. Mr. Devereux's generous offer to manage the western fields is, however, predicated on a false assumption. He claims the fields are unproductive because the soil is soured. That is not true. The fields are unproductive because they are without water. She unrolled one of the old master's maps and pinned it to a board. This map, from 1820, shows the irrigation system that once made those fields the most fertile in the county. The water came from the springs on what is now Mr. Devereux's land. Lucian jumped to his feet. This is irrelevant. That land has been in my family for 20 years. The water is mine. The water may be on your land, Mr. Devereux, Constance said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. But the right to that water is not yours alone. She produced the vellum covenant. She held it up. This is a deed of covenant, dated 1798, signed by your great-grandfather and Mr. Crane's. It grants your family use of the water, but it explicitly forbids the obstruction of the flow to Alderbrook. It is a perpetual covenant that runs with the land. For 20 years, your family has been in breach of this legal agreement. You have not simply neglected to maintain the channels. You have actively diverted them, starving our land to enrich your own. A gasp went through the room. This was not a matter of mismanagement. It was an accusation of a historic crime. Lucian's face, for the first time, lost its polished charm. It was blotchy with rage. "This is an outrage! The desperate slander from a woman caught with her hand in the till! This document is meaningless, a forgotten piece of paper." "It is not forgotten," a quiet voice said. Gideon Crane rose to his feet. He was holding a sworn affidavit. "And it is not meaningless. This is a statement from a master surveyor whom I hired last week. He inspected the head of the spring on Mr. Devereux's land. He found clear evidence of a recently constructed dam made of earth and stone, diverting the main flow of water away from the old channels leading to Alderbrook and into a reservoir on Mr. Devereux's own property. The dam, he estimates, was built within the last 20 years. He placed the affidavit on the table in front of Lady Ingram. The theft of Alderbrook's water is not a historical matter. It is an ongoing criminal act. The room fell into a stunned silence. The case was complete. The motive for Lucian's actions was suddenly brutally clear. He wanted the Western fields to appear worthless, so he could buy them cheaply, thus extinguishing any future claim on the water he was stealing. His attacks on Constance were a desperate attempt to discredit the one person who was likely to uncover his fraud. Lucien Devereux stood frozen, his face pale, his mask of civility shattered. He looked around the room, at the faces of his peers, and saw not support, but cold, unforgiving judgment. Lady Ingram read the surveyor's report. She looked at the covenant. Then she looked at Lucien Devereux, her eyes like shards of flint. "Mr. Devereux," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "you have not only slandered this young woman, but you have also, it appears, been party to a conspiracy to defraud your neighbour and impoverish this county. This board will recommend a full legal inquiry, and I would advise you to find a very, very good lawyer." She banged her gavel. "This matter is closed." It was over. Constance had not just been vindicated, she had been victorious. She had won not with tears or appeals, but with competence, with memory, with the quiet, unassailable power of the truth. As the room erupted into a buzz of shocked conversation, she slowly, carefully, began to stack her ledgers. Her work was done. In the chaotic aftermath of the meeting, as people crowded around to offer congratulations to Gideon and stunned looks to the disgraced Lucien Devereux, Constance slipped away. She had no taste for the public celebration of her victory. The vindication was a quiet, solid thing inside her, and it needed no audience. She walked back to the inn where they had taken rooms, a mind strangely peaceful. She was packing her small bag when a knock came at the door. It was her Aunt Philippa. Her face was a ruin of smeared powder and panicked dismay. "Constance! The scandal! The Devereuxs! What have you done?" she hissed, closing the door behind her. "I told the truth, Aunt," Constance said calmly. "The truth?" Philippa's voice rose. "You have made an enemy of one of the most powerful families in the county. You have made a spectacle of yourself, of us. No one will receive us now." Constance stopped packing and looked at her aunt. For the first time, she felt no anger, no resentment. She felt only a distant, clinical pity for this small, frightened woman, so trapped in her web of social anxieties. "There is no us anymore, Aunt Philippa." She walked to the writing desk and picked up a small, bound book. It was her own personal account ledger. "For 10 years I have managed your household. I have paid your bills, stretched your funds, and kept you from ruin. In return, you were paid £50 for my services at Alderbrook, a salary I never saw. She opened the book. I have kept an account. The £50, minus the meagre allowance you provided me, comes to £42.10. I will require that amount. Philippa stared at her, aghast. You dare to demand money from me? It is not a demand. It is a final accounting, Constance said. I am no longer your ward, and I am no longer your keeper. You will give me what is mine, and I will trouble you no more. There was a new authority in her voice, an unbreakable core of self-possession she had not had before. Philippa, for the first time in her life, seemed to recognize that she had no power over her niece. Defeated, she fumbled in her reticule and counted out the money with trembling fingers. Constance took it, her expression unchanging. Thank you. I wish you well, Aunt. It was a dismissal, polite and absolute. Philippa, speechless, turned and fled the room. Constance finished her packing. A chapter of her life, a long and painful one, was finally closed. She did not know what would happen next. Her work at Alderbrook was, in a sense, complete. She had uncovered its secrets, exposed its enemies, and laid the foundation for its recovery. Perhaps Mr. Crane would hire a new, male land agent now. Perhaps he would thank her, pay her a handsome bonus, and send her on her way. The thought left a hollow ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. She was looking out the window at the darkening street when another knock came. It was Gideon. He stood in the doorway, silent for a moment, simply looking at her. The noise and triumph of the town hall seemed a world away. I thought you might have left, he said. I was settling an old account, she replied. He nodded, understanding. Come, he said. Walk with me. He led her not back to the town, but away from it, along a quiet path that ran by the river. The winter air was cold and sharp, but she did not feel it. They walked in silence for a time, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground. They stopped at a small stone bridge overlooking the dark, rushing water. The first stars were beginning to appear in the twilight sky. What you did today, Gideon began, then stopped. He seemed to be searching for words, a rare thing for him. You saved more than the estate. You saved its honor. He turned to face her, his expression serious, stripped of all its usual guards. The ledgers and the accounts are only part of the story. The work is not finished, Constance. He used her first name. It landed in the quiet air between them with the weight of an event. The water will be restored, he continued, his voice low and intense. The fields will be ploughed, the house will be filled. But it will be an empty victory if you are not there to see it. Alderbrook is not just stone and soil anymore. You have given it a heart. You are its heart. Constance could not speak. She could only look at him, her own heart beating a slow, powerful rhythm. He took a step closer. He did not reach for her hand. He simply held her gaze. I am not a man for poetry. I am a man of facts, of contracts. So I will be plain. He knelt. He knelt on the cold, frozen earth of the riverbank, a man of immense power and wealth, kneeling before his appointed agent. The position of archivist is closed, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I wish to offer you a new one, a permanent one, that of my wife, of the mistress of Alderbrook. I am not asking you to be rescued. I am asking you to be my partner, to build with me, to live with me. I am asking you to choose me." He looked up at her, his face open, vulnerable, waiting. Plainly, "Will you marry me, Constance?" The cold air, the rushing river, the entire world seemed to fall away. There was only his question, hanging in the twilight. It was not a question about love, not in the flowery language of poets. It was a question about work, about partnership, about a shared future. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. She thought of her aunt's house, of a life of invisible servitude. She thought of the cold, dead rooms of Alderbrook as she had first found them. And she thought of this man, this severe, honest, difficult man who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. He had not offered her a pedestal. He had offered her a partnership. He had not offered her rescue. He had offered her a choice. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong in the winter quiet. "Yes, Gideon. Together." He rose to his feet, and for the first time, he smiled. It was not a large smile, but it transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He took her hands in his, and his were warm. Together, they turned and walked back toward the lights of the town. Not toward the past, but toward the future they would now build, side by side. 2 years later, the harvest at Alderbrook was a miracle. The western fields, once a sweep of dust and sorrow, were now a rippling sea of gold. The wheat grew tall and heavy-headed, nourished by the steady, life-giving flow of water from the restored channels. The sound of the reapers, the rhythmic swish of their scythes, was a song of abundance that carried across the valley. The harvest was not just for Alderbrook. It was enough to feed the tenants, to fill the granaries, and to supply the markets in Marley and the 2 neighboring villages, just as it had in the old master's time. Constance stood on the low rise overlooking the fields, a gentle breeze teasing a loose strand of hair from her neat chignon. She was no longer Miss Abbott, the quiet, overlooked niece. She was Mrs. Crane, the mistress of Alderbrook. But the title was secondary to the reality. She was the architect of this prosperity, the mind that had guided the land back to health. Beside her, Gideon stood, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He was a changed man. The hard northern severity had been weathered away by sun and contentment. The lines on his face were still there, but now they were softened by frequent, quiet smiles. He was no longer just a man of industry. He was a man of the soil, as deeply rooted in this place as the ancient oaks that dotted the landscape. "The yield is even better than your projections," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. He was not speaking of her projections as an employee, but as his partner. "Your grandfather's methods were sound," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He knew the land was not a thing to be conquered, but a partner to be respected." Below them, in the flurry of harvest activity, they could see Hannah, no longer a grim, solitary guardian, but a bustling, cheerful commander of the household staff, directing the delivery of cider and bread to the workers in the fields. Jem and Wilf, now foremen, moved with the confidence of men whose skills were valued. The house behind them, once a cold, hollow shell, was now a warm and living home. Its windows shone with light, and smoke plumed from its many chimneys. The ivy had been stripped from the walls, the stone repaired, the rooms filled with simple, solid furniture that spoke of comfort, not of show. Constance was expecting their first child in the spring, a new life for a new era at Alderbrook. The ghosts of the past had not been banished, but they had been made peace with. The memory of Gideon's late wife, Delia, was honored with a quiet memorial in the village church. The failures of his father were no longer a source of bitterness, but a cautionary tale that underscored the value of their own hard work and honesty. Later that afternoon, they walked back toward the house, their path taking them through the kitchen garden. It was a riot of color and life, bursting with vegetables, herbs, and flowers. And against the south-facing wall, covering it in a cascade of glorious, fragrant blossoms, was the rose bush. The single, stubborn crimson rambler she had found clinging to life on her first day. She had nurtured it, fed it, and it had rewarded her with an impossible abundance. Gideon stopped and plucked one of the perfect, deep red roses. He tucked it carefully into her hair. "My grandfather's rose," he said softly. Constance reached up and touched its velvety petals. She thought of the first time she had seen it, a single point of defiance in a world of grey neglect. It had been a promise, a symbol of the life that still lingered, waiting to be coaxed back. Now, it was a symbol of fulfillment. She looked from the rose to the golden fields, to the warm stone of the house, and finally, to the face of her husband. She had come to Alderbrook a paid companion, a piece of currency in another's transaction, abandoned in a place of ruin. But in that ruin, she had found not a lost cause, but the work of her life, the home of her heart, and the love of a man who saw her, plainly and completely. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile of pure contentment. "Our rose," she corrected him gently. "Our home. Together." Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.